Good evening, good evening. Good evening, friends, colleagues, countrymen. Hello. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, Mr. Hayes. Dr. Hazel, yes, crowd control. Welcome back, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us again for our dinner plenary. And you have the great fortune of having me as your MC and moderator again tonight. So it is a pleasure to be back here having another round of incredible speakers and some great content. So I hope everybody's been enjoying the day so far and made new friends at your table. Good? Okay. Who's met somebody new here? More than, oh, wonderful. Okay, so we've already accomplished our first goal. Okay, wonderful, good. Well, I am so delighted, and thank you again to my dear friends and colleagues at Bank of America. Victor, you're here. We're so delighted to host the plenary dinner conversation with our incredible keynote speaker and panel that will follow afterwards. We have a really exciting conversation, actually, starting all about Virginia. Virginia is going to be the highlight tonight. Our changing demographics, what we look like, where we're going, what we could look like, and we have an incredible expert, really the leading expert, Dr. Chen Tsai, who leads the UVA's Weldon Cooper Center for, she is the director of the Demographics Research Group at the University of Virginia's Weldon Cooper Center for Public Service, thank you, where she has been in that role for close to 17 years and as a highly regarded and sought after speaker and researcher. And so she's going to walk us through some of the big things that are really shifting across Virginia and things that we're going to have to think about a little bit more intentionally as a philanthropic community. And after that, we are going to be joined by a panel, and we're going to have time for some questions. So everybody get your coffee and your dessert. And so, Chen, if you'd like to please come up here. Thank you for bearing with us without the podium. So Dr. Tsai, she has been with UVA again for almost over 16 years. She and her team advanced the Weldon Cooper Center's ambitious agenda for improving population data for Virginia and the nation, and deliver public impact research to build the capacity of Virginia's communities and organizations that serve the Commonwealth. So I think that includes us. She is a native of China. She received her bachelor's degree in economics and her master's degree in demography, both from Peking University, and she received her PhD in sociology from Brown. So we are so delighted and thrilled to hand the stage and the mic over to you. Chen, thank you for joining us, and I'm just going to get out of your way and hopefully not.
Thank you, Erin, for that lovely introduction. But you can forget all about that, how many years I've worked and all that. Good evening. My name is Chen Tsai, and my first name is pronounced Chen. Q has a CH sound in Chinese, so call me Chen. I'm honored to be here tonight, and I mean it. I was honored when I entered the room, and the first thing I saw was the regional map on each table. The map was created by our group a few years ago, and I was so happy to see it's being used by this wonderful organization. So thank you. I'm also honored to be invited to join you tonight. You know, your value of our work in demographics, and that means you see how demographic information can be useful to you. So that gives us a great satisfaction knowing the work we do can be useful and helpful to you. So thank you very much for having me. So first, let's look at the map of Virginia. And Virginia is very diverse in terms of its regions. You know, we have 8 regions on each of table, and people from all over different regions in Virginia coming here today. Well, you see, I colored them into, 4 colors, but really I want to differentiate urban and the rural. The dark brown you see is the 3 major metropolitan areas in our state: Northern Virginia, Richmond, Hampton Roads. They encompasses the golden crescent of Interstate 95 and 64. The dark brown area is the home to 70% of Virginia's population. 70%. The light brown color region is the other 8 metropolitan areas in our state. So 8 small metro areas, they are Winchester, Harrisonburg, Stanton, Charlottesville, Lynchburg, Roanoke, Blacksburg, and then Bristol. Those small metro areas is home to 18% of the population. The remaining are our rural areas. They are colored in green and light green. Now, green has, with small town, and then light green, completely rural. You see it's a pretty large area, stretching from eastern shore to northern neck, and westward to south side, southwest, and then up on Shenandoah Valley. It's often referred to rural horseshoe. It has the shape of a horseshoe. And you will see that in the following slides. And that's 12% of the population living in rural Virginia, or the green color, dark green and light green. So 1 in 8 people live in rural. 70% live in the 3 major metropolitan areas. So now, let's imagine you are balancing a chessboard on your hand. Okay, that balance point, let's call it the center of the chessboard. And if I move the pieces on the top, you probably will need to move your hand a little bit to keep balance, right? All right. So imagine Virginia is that chessboard on your hand, and where's the balancing point? So using the census data from previous census, 1940 over here, all the way to 2020, we created this map to show you where was the center of population and where is the center of population and where the center will be. So you see in 1940, based on the 1940 census, the center, if you look at the small map, you see better. The center was in the Mid-South. At that time, the South Virginia was populous, was prosperous, coal mining, manufacturing, the textile industry, crop growing like tobacco and the peanuts. Those were the backbone of Virginia's economy. And that's where most people live. So that's where you balance your chessboard. That's where you find the balancing point. And then later on, 40 moving to 50, 60, 70, you see the population center moves eastward. And that is, during the World War II and continuing on to the Cold War, the military installation, the shipbuilding, and then defense expanding, all those grew significantly. And people vote with their feet, right? Where the jobs are, they go to the jobs center. And that's why you see the population center shifted eastward toward Hampton Roads. And starting 1970, the federal spending has grown exponentially, and many jobs were created in Washington, D.C., Northern Virginia, Maryland area. That you see, then the center of the population in Virginia start to shift northward. So in the last 50 years, that center has been keep moving up. And we further project by 2030 and 2040, the center will be somewhere near Fredericksburg. That really means 50% of the population live north of Fredericksburg, 50% south of it. So we're talking about the population shifts. This is shift number 1. I will give you a test afterwards. If shifts. Shift number 1 is this population distribution shift. It does not happen overnight. It takes decades to make the move, but it is moving. And then, that's a way to show the distribution change over time. So I'm going to ask you a question. How does a population grow? People moving in, right? Does that grow? People moving out? Then it's a decline, right? What's the other reasons, population? What other things? Birth. Great, because often people forget about that, and I'm glad somebody said birth. Birth is a great component of growing, and the death is declining, right? So, in the last decade, between 2010 to 2020, guess what percent of Virginia overall population growth is contributed to more births, and what percent is contribute migration, people from other states or other countries moving into Virginia? Any like 20-80 or 50-50, any guess? Just one. I heard somebody say 60-40. That's right. It is. So people don't realize that the natural increase, the birth minus death, is actually the major component of population growth. That just shows how important it is. Any species, in order to sustain, you need to have more births than deaths. But I'm going to show you a couple of maps. It's not conventionally true that places should have more deaths than births. Just think of it should be always more babies than deaths. But this is in 2010 to 2019. There are a number of localities in Virginia already experienced more deaths than births in that 10 years. And then you want to pay attention, those localities mostly are the rural communities. That's pretty much, quite a few, right? You wouldn't expect so many of them. Well, how about the last decade? A lot more, not only rural areas, but also some of the small metro areas. Right, you want to look again? Why so? Well, the birth rate has been low, and it's still declining. So we don't have as many babies born as we would expect. And the death is going up, not because of poor health or all that. It's just because we have more older people, and this group is the most susceptible to death. So in the rural areas and even in some small urban areas, when there are not enough babies born and then older people stay in place and the young people move out, and that's what we see. So you see those areas are prone to population decline. But of course, that's only one component. The other is migration, right? And Virginia used to be the state attracting business, attracting people, and that was true in the 2000s. And it's not so much in the last decade because we are actually experiencing out-migration also in the last 2 decades. So the next map shows you the localities, the community with more people moving out than moving in the 2000s. So again, the rural horseshoe, I want you to have that visual in your mind. The rural, again, those localities are typically the rural communities. And last decade, there are more. And even including some Northern Virginia localities. The cost of living, the housing price, and with the retirement population, more people moving out of Northern Virginia as well. Fairfax County, for example, is the largest county in our state. It is growing only because the birth data offset the out-migration data. So, the out-migration, the the death outnumbering births, and the overall, even in the urban areas, population has been growing slower than the decade before, resulting in the slowest growth rate since the 1920s. So if you look at the chart, 1920 was about 0.5% each year. That's the annual growth rate. And the 2010 was just about 0.6, 0.7, and it's the lowest since 1920s. And look at the 2000s and 2010, we were just about half of what we were in 2000s. And then looking ahead, our office is already starting to project population for 2030, and that slow growth is going to continue this decade, precisely for the same reason: the lower birth rate and higher deaths, and not to mention COVID impact us in a significant way. Migration has been very slow in the last few years. People are not moving in, and plus telecommuting. People they don't have to move to the new job. They can work from home and still do the job. So we really predict for this decade the growth rate will continue to be low and consistent with the trend we saw last decade. So this is shift number 2. We shift from a pretty good fast growth state to a much slower growth in this decade and continuing on. The next one, the third shift, I'm going to give you 2 visual shapes to know age, shifting from the shape of a triangle to rectangle. So this is more than 100 years ago, Virginia population by age. So you see the bottom is under 10, then you have 10 to 20, 20 to 30, and then over 70. Why we only say over 70? Because back then, life expectancy was 48. So if you live to 50, pretty good. 70, very rare. So we stopped at 70. We don't bother for 80 or... I know. And on average, each woman had 4 children. 4 children. And that's why you see the shape it is. You have a very broad base. Lots of kids. And of course, over the years, and not many older adults. And that's a triangle shape. Although with the improvement of life and the health and all that, improvement of mortality, we have more on the top. But still, more or less, until about 60 years ago, it's still the triangle shape, which makes sense, right? If you think of a big family reunion picture, it's always a lot of kids or even babies, and then middle age, and then you have a few older folks, right? So that is the shape for a normal conventional population. What do we look now? Well, to keep considering, we still say over 70. We're not breaking down, okay, now we're over 85, all that. But still, you see, we are now become a rectangle, right? We don't have a broad, long base of kids and children or young adults. We have a lot of older people. And why is that? Well, first, our life expectancy has improved significantly. Virginia is not just 48, of course, not a 48 year as 100 years ago. We are now 79, so good news. Good. So that's why we have the top, pretty long. On the other hand, on average, every woman has 1.5 kids, not 4. 1.5. It is below the replacement level, which is 2.1. Each woman needs to have a little bit more than 2 children in order to replace 2 of you, right? That makes sense. But we are not having 2. We are 1.5. And that's why the shape over the decades, after baby boom, after the baby boomers and all that, and now baby boomers are the long one. You see the 50s to 60, 60 to 70. Those are baby boomers. And their children echo boomer 20 to 30, 30 to 40. But then below them, shorter. It should be longer, but they're shorter. And if fertility remains low and continue to decline, COVID again actually depressed fertility as well. In the future decades, we may see a shape not even rectangle, a shape of a dreidel with a smaller bottom. That won't be good. It's not what it should be. We need the mortality improves. That's great news. But then we also need a workforce. We need a bigger base to support our economy, to support our the community, everything. But so the birth, death, migration, impact not only the population growth, but then also the shape of our population, the age distribution. So this is shift number 3, triangle to rectangle in terms of age. Shift number 4, race. I want to tell you the race is from single race to multi-race, if I put it very simply that way. First of all, we have to remember, because you all fill out the census form, American Community Survey data, or other form, you go to doctor's office, you fill out the form, you take the kids to school, you fill out the form, race. It's all self-reporting, right? However you identify yourself as, that's how you report. I want to give you an example. This is a very small racial group, and precisely because it's small, and it's not a big thing in people's mind, it's a perfect example. Before 2000 census, everybody was only allowed to pick one race category. You check only one box only. And that's 18,000 Virginians picked the box of American Indian. 2000 was the first census that allowed people to pick more than one race. Pick as many as you think you fit in. Because Census Bureau recognized our nation's demographic was changing. A single race category didn't meet the needs, so allowing people to pick more. And then you see a big jump in 2000. More than 62,000 Virginians reported they are American Indian. That grew a little bit, 80 to 80,000 in 2010. But 2020 census, that the number just released last year in August. Look at that jump. It is not because American Indian woman is having 4 or 5 kids. It's not because a lot of American Indian people moved to Virginia all of a sudden in that 10 years. It is people who self-identify themselves changed. 23andMe, Ancestry.com. People say, hey, it's fascinating, family history. More and more people identify themselves as multiracial. So this is the number that people checked this box. They may only check this box, they may check the other box as well, but here is a number. Just to show you how people's self-identification changed, either because category census allowed them to, and also because over time, they think again, they have more information, and then that's how they report, right? Okay, second, multiracial, I was saying single racial to multiracial, is really the interracial marriage, interracial birth in our country and in our state. The immigration flow, the large immigration flow in the 1990s and the 2000s, as you know, a lot of Asian population, Hispanic population came to this country, and those two categories grew significantly. But then also, it facilitates a lot of interracial marriage, interracial birth. So I want to show you this one. Among young people, what's the race they fit in? So the blue dot is race alone, those who only report one race. And then the green dot is that race plus some other race, multiracial. So those are for children under 15 in 2019. About 50% of children under 15 report they are white alone, just white. But about 70%, they are white plus something else. That means 20% of all children under age 15 are multi-race in that white, at least have one white parent, and then one either non-white or white but the Hispanic parent. That's the difference. And the same with black kids, 20% of Virginia kids under 15 are black. But if you include those who are, my daughter told me, Blasian. I said, what is that? That's black and Asian. And so my Blasian friend, my Asian, kids are talking that new vocabulary. So 25 of the kids are, at least identify at least one parent is black. And same with Asians, 7% versus 10%. And American Indian, that's really low. If you just like a American Indian alone, that's about 0.2. But if you allow for multi-race, that's 1.5. So really, race has changed significantly in terms of people how people identify themselves. And then race is the most sensitive thing, right? We don't know how to talk about it. And even the data don't give us a clear answer. And as founders, you may target the programs based on race, but then what race are we talking about? Are we narrowly just white alone, black alone? And this 2 or more races, multi-race, is 1 in 10 Virginians is multi-race right now, 10%. So who are they? They are Asian, they are Blasian, they are whatever, I can't even pronounce, what the new terms can be. And that's a shift from having multiple categories and each grow, now to such a mixed, and to the point you don't even know how to make sense of the race. So here are the 4 shifts. And remember, none is happening overnight, and all have taken years or decades, and we are still in the shift. It's just really nice to recognize what we have become and what we may become. And the shift of population distribution, the shift of population growth, the shift of our age structure, the shift of our racial composition. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chen. That was fascinating. And on the committee, we got to have a sneak peek, but it was just, you brought it to life, and it was incredibly fascinating. I have so many questions. We're actually going to have a panel now of 3 funders, and we're really going to talk about just what the reactions are and what we are doing now as philanthropists, what we should be doing, what we can be doing. And we'll have some time for questions from the audience. And so I would like to welcome our wonderful panel here to the stage. And so please come up. I will introduce you. And I think I'm just going to take this end seat down here. So delighted that we are joined by 3, well, we have 3 perspectives. We have from the rural perspective, Mary, thank you, Mary Fenton. She leads the Alleghenies Foundation. You heard from her in her brilliant work earlier. Sherry Armstrong, who leads the Community Foundation for Greater Richmond, and Wayne Talaferro, he's our national funder. Actually, why don't you sit here, because there's a microphone. That makes a lot of sense. Good. National funder with the Lumina Foundation, which many of you know focuses on post-secondary success and workforce. And we are really fortunate that Wayne is actually a Newport News native, and so he just came from down the road and funds in Virginia. So welcome. Thank you for joining us. And I'm going to actually start with the rural perspective. And so, Mary, thank you for joining. And what jumped out at you as you're listening to these data points here? So, given your perspective and everything that you do within the parts of the state that have some, changing color schemes up there on those maps, but please share your perspectives.
Thank you, Erin. Did I get the right mic?
Okay, good.
First of all, Chen, that was really fascinating, and I'm from central western Virginia, which was one of the counties that showed up pretty consistently with all things that you worry about. So, declining population, we were there. We were a rural small town, which differentiated us slightly from our neighbors, who were all rural. So we're fairly isolated. So looking at the map and looking at the demographics, one of the first things that struck me is this combination of an aging population, a declining population, and fertility rates going down. And to paraphrase Jim Johnson, if any of you heard him speak at the Southeast Council meeting a few years ago, we could all go home and get real busy tonight, and we aren't going to birth our way out. Say it. Fun. And the reality is that's where we stand. And so it's kind of it's a struggle because rural places, in my experience, and especially Appalachian places, are a little bit suspicious of strangers and not really open to new ideas. So if we can't birth our way out of our population decline, then what can we do to perhaps bring new people in as we do have job openings? And I think it raises a really important question about acceptance, diversity, and inclusion, as we also look at that last slide and talk about what ethnic and racial diversity looks like, cultural diversity. So I think I'm just going to flag that as one. Do you want me to change out?
Okay, I think you're going in and out, so let's try this one. Thank you.
So,
Thank you. Oh.
nothing? Should we test it? Should we switch mics, switch chairs? I'm testing.
Yeah. Is that, can you hear me?
Okay, why don't we just, sorry about that.
I think we shifted
We'll
the
share.
chairs.
We're dusting the cobwebs off of, conferences, right? So this is
Okay,
ready to get it out here.
Here we go. Thank you, tech team. You're great. Sorry, I think we messed up our seating order. But having said that, so my first reaction was really around what do we do with a shrinking population, a desire to bring people in and deal with some of these cultural and diversity questions around preparing our communities to grow and appreciate this history and also be accepting of newcomers. So I think that's kind of my first takeaway. The second one I hope we can come back to, but I'm just going to flag education and workforce development, and I think Wayne's going to say a lot more about this. But rural communities, we did a survey with our community several years ago, and as many strengths as our schools have, we don't have a high academic press, meaning we don't have a high push to get beyond high school. And yet workforce skills are showing a high propensity towards 2 years and more. And I looked up the statistics. Our county is at about 15% baccalaureate degrees. Arlington is 75%. There's a reason Amazon's looking for a workforce in Northern Virginia. Beyond me, I don't know why they want to live there, but some of you Nova people, our rural areas are really struggling, and part of it is we don't have the workforce appeal. And I hope all of us will learn about the Horseshoe Initiative. And talking to Erin, it speaks to this horseshoe that Chen mapped for us. It's also some of our border counties. But these are regions which, if we look statistically, we're a two Virginia state. And that region I hope we'll come back to in a little bit. And my final point is just around the aging population. And one of the great things about rural places is people who have lived there most of their lives want to stay there. But we don't have a long network of continuum of care, aging in place structures, and we don't have young people to do the work to take care of older people who need care. So that one gets really complicated, and I'm eager to hear what everybody else has to say, so I'll just say aging is something we should continue to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. Sherry, so thank you. I guess we can switch. Yeah, we can share the mic there.
Share.
So your perspective, so you're in an urban center there and where the population has been shifting and changing and experiencing all this in real time. So what did the presentation really make you think about and in your work and what your team is focusing on at the foundation?
So I would say two things. First of all, it hits me, and I think we are all realizing this in the Richmond region. The face of philanthropy is going to look different down the road, right? And how philanthropy shows up, who the philanthropists are, and we have to, especially in the Richmond region, philanthropy was built on a lot of legacy. We all know our history, and we're very fortunate. We're a very generous community, and there's been a legacy there, but the future is going to be different, especially when I look at the way the population is shifting to more mixed minority kind of. We have to be thinking about what's going to resonate and how do we build philanthropy in the future. So that's one thing. Another thing for me is I think, and you see it in the shifts, philanthropy was built on the old economy model, not the new economy, right? So what does that look like in terms of how our younger generation is showing up in the workplace, in the economy, and there's a delayed result to that in terms of how you build income and wealth maybe over time. So I just think what we've been able to build to date and what the future looks like, we're gonna have to be innovative and sensitive to that and figure out how that is more multicultural and more inclusive as we go forward. So the face of philanthropy is gonna be different, and we've got to deal with that and figure out how do we bring more people to the table and be part of the solutions going forward. I think the second part of that is, I think Richmond, the Central Virginia area, and the thing for me is there's a sense of urgency here to think differently and not be complacent. We've, even during the pandemic in the short term, we've been able to deal with things, but when you see the population migration to Northern Virginia and you see we have to act more as a mega region, and how do we work differently to solve these problems and leverage resources. And I think philanthropy has to be in the position to try to bring that collective action together. And I just don't think we're going to be able to deal with be so local based without trying to figure out how we bring in other resources. So when I looked at that pattern going up to Northern Virginia, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing one way or the other, but we have some complacency in our region that thinks that everything is okay and we're going to be fine, and we just sort of, tinker with certain things, then we'll be all right. But if you look at those population trends in 20 years, that's not going to be the case. So I just think there's a sense of urgency for us to act in the urban areas, to do something different and be much more strong and progressive in the way we're moving forward.
Yeah. I know a lot of people agree with that sentiment, and your comments about the new economy are absolutely spot on. Wayne, so you're sitting here from your national funder lens and looking at Virginia. Virginia is a state that, a handful of states that Lumina has invested in quite intentionally. But what do these statistics kind of jump out at you, and what's going to keep you up at night a little bit more than you already are thinking about in terms of education and post-secondary success goals and workforce? So there's a lot to chew on here.
Yeah, so many things keep me up at night. One of the things that jumped out to me when I was watching the presentation, particularly around the low birth rates and around kind of the diversification of the population, is what the implications mean for enrollment declines in education across the spectrum. And that's particularly true in the space I'm in post-secondary education. We've seen some pretty steep drops and declines over these past 2 years with the onset of COVID and coming out of the pandemic, and there are a range of reasons for that. But when we think about the consequential kind of nature of that situation, just giving how post-secondary education is a gateway to well-paying jobs, more so than not, and economic mobility, it's really important that we hone in on this particular issue so that we can make sure that as we move forward, folks are able to benefit, not only access higher education, but also benefit from the returns. So I want to zoom out a little bit first to talk nationally, kind of what we're seeing, because in the education space, students are also getting older in post-secondary education, and they're also diverse on many more levels. And so there's increasing access and increasing success as well, but those benefits aren't being evenly dispersed. And so to your point about rural populations, we're not seeing the same access, we're not seeing the same returns for those populations. We're not seeing that in different segments of communities of color. And that's really important to really be mindful of as we see some of this increased diversity and some of the different changes that we're talking about here. And so when you kind of put all that together and think about some of the foreshadowing effects, tapering off birth rates, lower enrollments, increasing diversity, there's kind of this compounded urgency to make sure we don't have this divided future or this divided recovery where some communities are gaining and some people are having success and others aren't. And I think about that from an outlook perspective long term, not just what's happening now. Because again, more so than not, the jobs of the future and where growth is going to be are going to be in places that require some of that education and training beyond high school. And so with philanthropy, I think it's important for us to think about equity in this conversation, so that as we are moving forward and as we are building back better, right, to use a slogan, or as we're thinking about the economy of the future where everyone can fully participate, that we don't see these significant divides based on region or locality, or that we don't carry forward some of these stark disparities by race and income as well, and region overlaying that. And that means that we have to really be thinking differently about how do we provide access to education, access to opportunities that allow people to mobilize economically in ways that are different than what we are currently providing now. Tapering off enrollments, tapering off birth rates, we're going to still have a need to be able to provide education and training for folks who are in the adult population who are also, in that middle age to upper age, who need to upskill or need to be able to access some of these opportunities for these pathways to good jobs and to fully participate. And then also we need to make sure that we are providing the infrastructure necessary in all these communities. So again, you don't have these stark contrasts in opportunity by region. That means investing in digital infrastructure and making sure that we have the economic infrastructure so that we can attract the kinds of jobs to places that you don't really see. And then lastly, I think philanthropy can think systematically about these problems. So it's not just about what can we do with our particular charitable resources, but how can we steer influence within the state, especially when we consider the platforms that we have, the proximity we have to certain stakeholders in the state. We can really shape priorities to make sure that our economic future is inclusive of everyone, despite the trends that we're seeing here, right? And so, or within the context of these particular trends. And then at the same time, seed, I think, not just provide stopgap resources, but really seed change. Work in concert with entities that are providing public resources, especially given some of the influx we're seeing even now with some of these recovery resources, infrastructure resources. How can we influence the equitable distribution of that so that we can sustain a future that's responsive to what we're talking about here today?
So you just had a few things that you wanted to share, right, with the group. Okay. Well, why don't we pick up on that thread, because you mentioned building back better and equity, right, at the center here, and not having this divided recovery. So let's just go a little bit deeper. Talk about some of the things that you're seeing and you're doing that are in your communities, really, that are addressing this shift. We're seeing the racial diversity makeup of our state definitely changed and shifting, and you're each wearing just different hats and seeing it from different lenses, but I think there's also a lot of commonality. But can you just kind of comment on that trend?
Yeah, so, I was listening to what Wayne was saying, and I think it's interesting that we're all sort of sitting in this room in the philanthropic sector, but I really, really think going forward we have to do this cross-sector work in order to have the kind of impact that we want to have. And what was interesting, I think, during COVID particularly, and then as resources started to flow, there was some unique opportunity where new systems were being built to address the need in the community, which was really great. Like different partnerships were coming together and really working together. Unfortunately, what I've seen now that we've kind of getting back to a little bit sense of normalcy, it's like everyone's kind of pulling back into their corners. And so I think philanthropy really has a responsibility and a role to kind of accelerate that and keep some of those things going. But I say that in the context of one of the things I'm most proud of in our region, even prior to COVID, was this focus on affordable housing. And we have great champions and leaders in our community who came together and created this partnership for housing affordability. And what's so amazing about that, it's private sector money, public sector money, and it's really set a table of public-private partnerships and then trying to bring the business community more into the mix on that. We have a lot of work to do, but I think it set the table for once COVID hit, and then we the murder of George Floyd and the racial disparity, there was really some data that came to light that say we've got to hone in on Black home ownership as a way to build wealth and build income. And so, the way the community has come together around that, and way philanthropy is supporting that, I think is really a great opportunity for us. It's not easy by any means, but it's leveraging public money, private money, and relationships to actually stick to something, to know it's going to take some time, and we're going to have to build on it over time. So, I think that's the type of creative solutions we need to do around workforce development, education, access to education, because we know enrollments are down, but we've got to figure out that's disrupted. So what does that look like as we go forward? Those are just that's one example I would raise, where now we're trying to think about equity and wealth building and income generation in a way that we probably were not thinking about that prior to the pandemic. But that sort of shined the light on, here's some opportunity. And then there's a lot of work going on around minority business development, minority startup communities. I mean, economic inclusion is really becoming something that the region is embracing. And I think if you can find the right frame by which people will embrace things, you can move people to work together. And so those are some of the examples I would say we're working on.
That's a lot. I'm going to lift up one, and that is just a change of a conversation with the community college, particularly around the G3 programs and the incentives to attend school, and really changing the conversation to sort of who's being served. And that conversation has shifted not only an awareness of outreach, but a deeper awareness of the fact that we had no faculty of color on our community college campus. And so having to really get deeper into what is the culture of the campus and how accepting is it, and what can be done. And so I wouldn't say any of us have cracked that nut yet, but that's kind of the place we are, and I just encourage folks to change the conversation.
Efforts we're investing in around. Lumina is investing in Virginia right now in effort to strengthen pathways to good jobs via credentials. And we're investing in a number of states. And one thing that, you mentioned the G3 program and the Fast Forward program that feeds into that. We, to the point I was talking about earlier around disparities, it's not enough for folks of color, especially given the changing demographics we're seeing, to just be able to have access. It's also important for folks to be able to have meaningful economic outcomes catalyzed by these pathways. And so, thinking about the workforce and what it's going to command, we don't want to have a workforce that's divided along lines in a disparate way. And so, we've been working with the community college system in the state to really be intentional about how do we strengthen pathways to careers that have meaningful earnings outcomes. How do we reduce segregation occupationally, where certain folks have not been able to access certain jobs, right, in a pathway where you might see a certain demographic going into one segment of that labor force and another certain segment going into a higher paying segment. So how do we strengthen and kind of mitigate some of that? So I think, again, it's about intentionality. I don't think we shy away from what we're seeing, but that we lean in and really think critically about how do we shape efforts so that the systematic input and the outcome can be equitable.
We will have some questions in a few minutes here, but the last thing I really want to talk about is the aging statistics. And so who funds an aging here? Just show of hands. Do we have? Okay. Let's talk about that. Not the top of the list in terms of a lot of funding support, actually. And we just saw that the shift is really growing. We're an aging population, and more deaths. More people are just reaching those upper echelons, and you're seeing it a lot, Mary, in your community, but it's everywhere. What are you thinking about? Like, what are you going to take home and kind of work into your practice? Actually, every one of you, in terms of this aging situation that we've got here. I mean, we're not the only state, but those are some pretty startling statistics that we just saw. and as funders, something to think about.
So I knew Erin was really interested in this topic, and I've been racking my brain to go, so what are we doing about it? And the truth is that the maybe great tragedy is that much of aging care is by default in the private sector, and it is incredibly inequitable. And it has one extreme in this continuum that is private pay, continuum of care, and should the resources be there, maybe top notch compared to maybe other places in the world. And then there's the sort of statistics we don't talk enough about, which is how much of our Medicaid dollars go for families and individuals who are assetless and being cared for, often in a public setting. And then there's this huge gap in the middle, which has so many places where individuals fall through the cracks. And I don't think any of you would be new to someone you could name in your community who died as an elderly person during COVID, probably from the pandemic of loneliness, more than anything that you can actually name as an illness other than deep depression and sadness. So in this moment, I want to honor my friend Howard Hammond, who had many challenges, but I have thought a lot about how hard aging issues are and how disconnected we are in our ability to serve them. And in rural places, we do really well with family connections until that fragile fiber falls apart, because that sandwich generation is also juggling 2 jobs and a child and you name it. You know what I'm talking about. So I just think we have not really gone to school yet on what it takes to have whole communities. And I think even as we look at the segregation of age for populations that can afford care and alternatives, there is a little bit of a disconnect from younger generations. And so finding ways to have multi-generational lifestyles is just another pin to put in the map, because I've heard many residents of senior care facilities just say, I meet old people like me and I watch them die around me. And I really wish I had relationships with younger people who gave me promise about the world to come. So that's what I have to say on that topic, Erin.
Thank you, Mary. Please, yes. Julie?
Yeah, I would say ditto on that. In my prior life, for many years, you could work in community, and the nonprofit sector did much more to serve the aging population, but that has evolved and more has become privatized. So it's really difficult to know where you plug in and where you can do that at scale, I think, to really try to support that. But I do think we have a dilemma. And then I think when you think about the aging population versus the birth rate, right? I mean, I have 30-something-year-old children, and I have one that has a child, right, out of 5 of them. And so you sort of watch that and go, are they going to have children? Are they going to get married? What are they going to do? Or what's their, makeup? So, my husband and I are thinking, there's nobody to take care of us probably, but I mean, you think about that, right? So just that generation and the way that's happening, that's going to have an implication on our sector as well. But we're already struggling with it because we have the sandwich generation of people taking care of aging parents and children. I wish I had an answer to that. I think it's really hard right now there's a lot of policy issues around this, I think, and there's things that we have to think about differently and more creatively than the nonprofit sector, I think, can do alone. And so I wish I had an answer to it, but I think it's a tough one to get at scale. I think it's really tough.
Yeah, and Wayne, you were talking about older students. It's not just within any type of funder. So I don't know if you have any reflections on the aging topic, but it's got us thinking. Please.
Yeah, in the education space, we typically think about, the future of labor first and shortages that are going to happen as a result of folks aging out of the workforce, and how are we going to meet those shortage needs? How are we going to meet the needs, obviously, of a new dynamic economy, the future of work, all of those conversations, and where does education couple with that? But we haven't really had a conversation about the care economy that's going to create as well. And I think you all made some really fascinating points that I agree with wholeheartedly. I don't have a real answer to that question. It's just something I've been grappling with ever since seeing this and some of the conversations we've had previously, because we are going to have to think not only about meeting workforce demand that's going to be left, but also thinking about how do we appropriately care for folks, and also have the resources to make sure that the population that's aging has what they need, at the same time that the care conversation right now is very heavily about childcare in the mainstream. We have to think about this other conversation on the other end of the life spectrum. And that requires some policy fixes, but I think to the point you made earlier, I think there's a way for philanthropy potentially to kind of shape that conversation and shape some of the priorities. But I just don't know exactly what that looks like.
Well, how about some questions from the audience here? And we have some mic runners, and so why don't we go here in the front? And if everybody could just keep your hands up, we'll get to you.
Hello, my name is Edgar Arandayano. I work with the Mayor Foundation. Before that, I used to be a senior lead organizer with Legal Aid Justice Center. So there is one issue that it was not presented, which is the undocumented immigrant population. We know during the pandemic, they were the essential workers. They risked their lives. Many people die, but they are not even mentioned. So I would like if this panel mention about it, and also the philanthropy should address that issue. We are talking about 300,000 people who lives in Virginia, and they are really doing many jobs that many people are not going to do it. So they deserve a lot. Thank you.
Any commentary? I don't think anybody here would disagree at all. Yeah, commentary?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for acknowledging that. That's a big miss on all our parts, I think, for that. And I think it's really, really important that we acknowledge that and understand, particularly when everything happened with COVID, the people on the front lines were the people that were doing that kind of work and, supporting our community. And, I will just be honest and transparent with you to say that shined a light big time for us in our region that I wasn't aware of. And just when our community funders came together and worked with our Latino Hispanic organization to actually get money and resources to that organization with no questions asked and say, you know what, do what you need to do to support those families. And it was really interesting from the community foundation. We had a couple of donors actually that reached out and said, I want to give substantial money there. And the profile of the donor, you would not even imagine that's the profile of the donor. But they came forth, gave six-figure gifts to that organization to be able to go into the community. And Danny Avola at the time, when we were the health district, really kind of galvanizing and organizing us to be much more understanding of what we were dealing with. And it was just great to see that, we're just going to have to get resources to that community and make sure that we're doing more there. And I think we have to have more intentionality around that going forward. And there's some opportunities that have arisen in the Richmond area for us to do more of that. But thank you for acknowledging that. That's really important.
Other questions in the back?
Oh, it's me? Okay.
Yes.
Hi. Thank you for this sobering conversation, but necessary conversation. I'm Edward Jones with Weisberg Foundation, trustee there, as well as on staff at the Association of Black Foundation Executives. And so I'm thinking of that demographics piece, and someone mentioned what Jim Johnson had done 10 years ago, or the last census, to talk about these issues, and he called it, for example, the silver tsunami. the idea of the demographic shifts. And I remember being in some spaces with foundations, because he did a major tour with community foundations, I think, in other regions in this conversation. That was 10 years ago, and here we are. And so I can't help but wonder, what are we going to be talking about, or those who will be sitting in this room 10 years, or some room 10 years from now, what will we be talking about then? The same thing, or will there be a matter of taking what we've learned today and make sure that we're being responsive? I was stunned to see so few hands being raised when you asked about aging funding. And I'm getting old. We're all getting old, right? And I don't have kids, so I got to call my nephew and just check and see how he's doing, right? So I think it's a call to action. I think we've gotten a call to action. I think you all have given us some good guidance on your perspectives, but it's also an opportunity to think about how are we going to respond as a state, as a region, as a nation to address these issues. And so my question is, what are you all taking back to your foundations based upon what you've learned tonight?
So when I moved to a rural community, everybody says, oh, you'll fix everything fast, there's so few people, you'll figure it all out, they all meet each other. Well, the truth is they do all meet each other in a way, and you come together, and then we all look at each other and say, we're all going to the same meetings and we're doing the same thing. And so the answer is, there's a capacity issue that I struggle with, and I think I feel affirmed in being here today, not just tonight, to your question, that we've got to get serious about, because it doesn't matter where you are. If there's not enough people to so-called carry the water, come into the room, talk it through, figure out what you're going to do next, take the next step, come back together and keep it moving, then we talk a lot and we don't finish this exercise of trying to create good change. And sometimes that capacity resides in foundations, and sometimes it resides in nonprofit partners. And in our community, it's some of both. But I think your question and some of what you as a collective have given me is a resolve to really work this point of implementation that at least is my sort of struggle, which is how do we take good ideas and relevant information like Chin presented, connect it to the people who want and desire to know and desire good things, and then figure out the resourcing of that strategy to keep it moving. And so specific to your question in the aging arena, I do am aging, and I'm thinking about, this is relevant to a few of us in the room here. Not to call you out or anything, but I'm thinking about how understaffed our Council on Aging is. And there is a public entity with a fantastic director who can answer every single question you might throw at her and gives advice to family after family after family as if it's the first time she's ever met anyone. And I think about how exhausting that must be for her. But each of us is on a learning curve the first time we go through these kinds of questions of dealing with aging family members or self-aging issues. So you've made me think about, what could I do when I go back? Well, I think it's time to see Patrice and just sit down and say, what would you have us do? And what are the capacities that are missing to do the convening that might help us take Chen could come visit, and we could talk about these aging data, the data on aging, and then talk about what community capacity is needed for us to really deal with hard issues of transportation, hard issues of medical access, somewhat understaffed Meals on Wheel, but at least we have one. There are things we could name that are really good, but I think we've got to start the conversation. So thank you for what I count a challenge. So we'll see each other next year, and we'll see how we did.
Yeah. Wayne, you want to go? Then Sherry.
Sure, I'll be brief. I think I'll go back to my foundation, and this has really spurred a kind of breakthrough around some blind spots that we have. Thinking about kind of this aging demographic, some of the other pieces you talked about, how can we be more intentional about thinking about economic growth across region, across place, and across other dimensions that we haven't necessarily thought about. And I think, this group gives us kind of this collective entity now that we can tap into to start asking some of these questions we haven't asked, and then start to kind of galvanize and mobilize around, some particular solutions to your point, so that 10 years down the line, we aren't having the same conversation. We'll have thought about it a bit more proactively, although I guess we're thinking about it reactively at this point.
So a couple things I would add to that. I mean, the aging conversation, definitely. I think we've got to engage more in communities and figure that out. But the slide that hit me the most for our region is the movement of people, like when you go Richmond up to Northern Virginia, and this urgency we have around being intentional. We have to be intentional with our population and the people, because Richmond, the region, has this sort of complacency feeling sometimes of we're doing really well. And you go county by county and different places are doing well. But when I looked at that and said, you know, people are moving up the I-95 corridor, they might be stopping in Richmond, but they're moving out. And so we're going to end up being potentially a bedroom community of Washington, D.C. if we're not sort of thinking about that. And that there's some opportunity around some of those things. And so I think we as a philanthropic community have to kind of think about that. What's going to draw people to our region? What's the workforce? What are the community colleges, our college systems doing to really attract talent and maintain talent and have economic growth so that philanthropy can grow, so that we can be intentional about the things we're doing? And then how do we do that in an inclusive way? How do we leverage the assets with our demographic makeup in Richmond to actually really be different and be more bold? And so that migration chart, even with less births and all that kind of thing, that's our sense of urgency for our region right now. And how do we create some call to action around what we do more of and work better together to make sure that philanthropy, the nonprofit sector, and the business community are working collectively on the things we know we need to solve for?
Well, I just keep thinking about a phrase that you said, Mary, which was we need to really rethink this idea of whole communities, and then that all communities across Virginia are whole and inclusive and equitable. And really that is the challenge right now. And where do we want to be in 2030? So when we're all back here in 2030, that's the question. Are we almost, okay, last question, then Katie's giving me the look, so that's it.
I was just going to let you end, Erin. But I want to take us back to the aging conversation one more time, because I am an official old person. And so, and I have worked in the aging sphere as part of our earlier work at the Virginia Healthcare Foundation when we created Senior Navigator 20 plus years ago. And so just a few observations and thoughts for people. You know, cannot, as an old person, I cannot remember the statistic that, but a huge percentage of the care of the elderly happens in families. And, you know, we've got the continuing care retirement communities for those who can afford them, very small percentage of people. And then, you know, we've got a variety of facilities that are Medicaid facilities or that kind of thing at the lower end of the economic spectrum. But the huge portion of the caregiving burden for seniors is by family members, often women who leave their jobs or, you know, or have to, I mean, I know any number of people who have had to move from Virginia to go take care of ailing parents, you know, over the years. And so this is a hard nut to crack, because frankly, if you created a public program to kind of take the place of all of these family caregivers, it would bankrupt the country, especially since, so I'm an old enough person that I actually remember 25 years ago, looking at demographics, where everybody said, you know, in 25 years, we're going to have a lot of centenarians, people living to be 100, because we didn't have that 25 years ago. And we're going to have a shrinking younger workforce, you know, and all the things that that happened even 25 years ago. And so, you know, we're here. And it's a conundrum. But if you wanted to think about places to put some attention. Maybe it would be to around some caregiving initiatives, even like respite care for the caregivers. You know, things that can help folks, help give support to them. Those are kind of doable things that we have good examples of from, you know, different parts of the country and even the state. So, I mean, it's simple. It's not the grand policy answer, but I don't know that we have that. I also think that until you experience having to deal with an elderly parent or relative or friend and all that that entails, you don't think about it. Nobody wants, we are a youth-oriented society, and none of us want to think about being old and what that entails. And we all do different things to avoid that day when it comes. And so it's hard to get, when we tried to raise money for Senior Navigator back in the day, there are some funders who specialize in aging issues, but for the most part, people don't want to hear about it. The way we could sell it was because it was a technology initiative, you know, and so that's just something to think about in terms, and then just one final thing, you know, when people do a cost-benefit analysis kind of where they want to put their money and where they want to invest, people want to invest in children, and, you know, or the workforce, you know, going forward, because that is where the future is. And, you know, so they're harsh arguments, but you know, like, well, we've already, why should we invest in people who will not be with us fairly soon anyway? So, I mean, that's just, I think, a number of biases and things that go on that we all have to struggle with as we set our priorities.
Yes. Thank you. Well, I think that is a wrap, actually, and we've all learned a lot. And I just, you know, always think about the words of a great mentor. Just start with the end in mind. So let's just put 2030 out there, and let's just start to think about what we want it to look like. And thank goodness we have the Virginia Funders Network, so we can actually talk and engage. And I think we have a new networking group to start around aging. So yes, that's going to be the next step that I'm taking back. Thank you to our panel. Thank you, Sharon. This is wonderful. I think that we, for those of you who are still energetic and would like to conclude, we are going to reconvene over in the golf room bar at Eagles Restaurant. Yes, so right around the corner, just follow the funders and you'll see them there. So thank you again.